The satellite images arrived at the Pentagon at 6:47 a.m. Eastern Time, but it took analysts 4 hours to believe what they were seeing. Chinese naval assets, destroyers, supply ships, and what appeared to be a nuclear submarine were positioned just outside the 12-mile territorial limit of Venezuelan waters. At the exact same moment, 8,000 miles away in Beijing, Chinese Premier Li Qiang was staring at American satellite footage that made his hands shake. A U.S. carrier battle group larger than anything China had ever assembled was conducting routine exercises less than 500 miles from the Chinese coast. Two nuclear superpowers were playing the most dangerous game of chicken in human history, using geography as their weapon. I've spent 30 years studying how geography shapes the rise and fall of empires. I've traced how Rome's Mediterranean position enabled its expansion, how Britain's island geography secured its naval dominance, and how America's continental resources fueled its global reach. But I've never witnessed two superpowers colliding over the fundamental laws of geographic destiny. Today, I want to show you why this confrontation was inevitable, why China is destined to lose, and why geography, not ideology, not economics, not military technology, will determine which superpower controls the 21st century. This isn't about politics. This is about physics. The laws of distance, resources, and logistics that have governed human civilization for thousands of years, and those laws are about to crown a winner in the contest between American and Chinese global dominance. Spoiler alert, geography has already chosen the victor. The phone call between superpowers. Picture this. At 3:17 a.m. Beijing time, President Xi Jinping placed a direct call to Donald Trump, the first conversation between Chinese and American leaders since the Venezuelan operation began. The conversation, according to intelligence sources who risked their lives by talking to me, lasted exactly 11 minutes and 17 seconds. No diplomats, no translators, just two men who control nuclear arsenals discussing whether the world was about to end. "You cannot blockade our ships in international waters," Xi reportedly told Trump. "China will not accept American hegemony in Latin America." Trump's response revealed everything about his understanding of global geography. "Your ships are 8,000 miles from home. Mine are in my backyard. Do the math." Those two sentences capture the entire geopolitical reality of the 21st century. China, despite all its economic growth, military modernization, and diplomatic expansion, faces an insurmountable geographic disadvantage that no amount of political will can overcome. Distance matters. Proximity is power, and America owns the Western Hemisphere, the geographic trap that doomed China. To understand why China is destined to fail in Latin America, despite 20 years of successful economic expansion, you need to understand the basic mathematics of global logistics. China sits on the opposite side of the planet from Latin America. Not in some poetic or metaphorical sense, literally on the opposite side of a sphere. Every Chinese cargo ship, every Chinese naval vessel, every Chinese diplomatic mission to Latin America must cross either the Pacific Ocean plus the Panama Canal or the Indian Ocean plus the Atlantic Ocean. Minimum distance, 12,000 nautical miles. Maximum American interference opportunities, infinite. Compare this to American logistics. Every major Latin American capital is less than 2,500 miles from a major American port. American supply lines to Colombia are shorter than Chinese supply lines to Taiwan. When geography gives one side a 5-1 logistics advantage, the outcome isn't really in doubt. But the problem goes deeper than distance. China's access to Latin America requires passage through geographic choke points that America either controls or can close at will. The Panama Canal, American-built, American-influenced, and impossible to bypass for large vessels. The Strait of Malacca, 25% of all global maritime trade, easily blockaded by American naval forces. The Suez Canal, alternative route to Latin America, equally vulnerable to American pressure. Every Chinese ship headed to Latin America must pass through waters America can close. Fixed the Beijing breakdown. Chinese military planners had spent 2 decades developing strategies to project power into Latin America despite these geographic disadvantages. The plans were sophisticated, expensive, and as recent events proved, completely ineffective when challenged by American military force. Operation Golden Bridge was China's secret blueprint for challenging American dominance in Latin America through economic partnerships, infrastructure investment, and gradual military presence. Phase 1, economic penetration through trade and investment. Phase 2, infrastructure control through ports, railways, and telecommunications. Phase 3, military presence through security cooperation and naval visits. By 2025, China had successfully completed phases 1 and 2. Chinese companies controlled major ports in Brazil, Peru, and Argentina. Chinese banks had loaned over $140 billion to Latin American governments. Chinese infrastructure projects spanned from Mexico to Chile. Then came the Venezuelan operation, and all of China's careful planning collapsed in 17 minutes. According to leaked discussions from Chinese military leadership, the fundamental problem wasn't American military superiority. China could theoretically match American force projection with enough commitment. The problem was sustainable logistics. China could send naval forces to Latin America for short-term operations, but maintaining those forces, supplying them with fuel and weapons, and protecting the supply lines that connected them to China required resources that China simply didn't possess. "We can reach Latin America," one Chinese admiral reportedly said, "but we can't stay there." The American geographic advantage. What makes America's position in Latin America unassailable isn't just proximity, it's integrated geography. America doesn't just sit next to Latin America, it controls the geographic systems that connect North and South America to the rest of the world. The Gulf of Mexico, America's private lake. The Caribbean Sea, surrounded by American allies or territories. The Panama Canal connects the world's two largest oceans through territory America has dominated for over a century. Every major shipping lane that connects Latin America to global markets passes through water that America can control from bases less than 1,000 miles away. China has to cross 12,000 miles to challenge American power. America can project power across Latin America from bases in its own territory. But the real advantage is economic geography. Latin America's natural economic partners aren't in Asia, they're in North America. Mexican factories supplying American consumers. Colombian coffee shipped to American ports. Brazilian agricultural exports feeding American livestock. Venezuelan oil refined in American facilities. Geography created these economic relationships long before politics interfered with them. American and Latin American economies developed together because they're located on the same continental system. China can offer investment and trade, but it can't change the basic mathematics of shipping costs, time zones, and cultural connections. The desperation gambit. Understanding their impossible geographic position. Chinese leaders made a decision that intelligence analysts are calling the most desperate military gambit since Pearl Harbor. If China couldn't win a sustained competition for Latin America, maybe China could force America to back down through the threat of global confrontation. The Chinese naval deployment to Venezuelan waters wasn't designed to defend Venezuela, it was designed to force America to choose between escalation and compromise. Chinese nuclear submarines within striking distance of American territory, daring America to attack Chinese forces directly. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity: make the cost of American dominance in Latin America so high that America would accept Chinese partnership rather than risk nuclear war. But the strategy was also suicidal, because geography worked against China in this gambit just as much as it worked against Chinese economic expansion. Chinese submarines in the Caribbean were 8,000 miles from Chinese support, surrounded by American naval assets, and completely dependent on supply lines that America could sever at any time. China was threatening nuclear war from a position of geographic impossibility. Trump's geographic calculation. Trump's response to the Chinese naval deployment revealed his intuitive understanding of geographic power in ways that decades of diplomatic training could never provide. Instead of matching Chinese escalation with American military deployment, Trump did something that caught Beijing completely off guard. He did nothing. No dramatic naval movements, no threatening statements, no diplomatic protests, just patient waiting for geography to do its work. American submarines shadowed every Chinese vessel. American satellites tracked every Chinese movement. American logistics systems prepared for sustained operations. But America made no aggressive moves because America didn't need to. Geography was working for America, and against China every hour, those Chinese ships remained in the Caribbean. Every day of operations cost China resources it couldn't easily replace. Every mile from home base reduced Chinese operational capacity. Trump was letting distance and logistics defeat China's naval deployment without firing a shot. The collapse of Chinese logistics. What happened next proved every geographic theory about power projection that strategists had developed over centuries. Chinese ships in the Caribbean began developing mechanical problems that couldn't be fixed without major port facilities. Chinese submarines started showing stress fractures from extended operations far from home bases. Chinese supply ships couldn't maintain the fuel and food shipments necessary for sustained operations. Within 3 weeks, China's show of force had become a lesson in the limits of geographic power projection. Chinese naval forces weren't being defeated by American military action, they were being defeated by the basic physics of operating 12,000 miles from home base. Distance had defeated the People's Liberation Army Navy more effectively than any American weapon. Beijing faced a stark choice: escalate to actual combat and risk losing Chinese naval assets to American forces operating from nearby bases, or retreat, and acknowledge that Chinese power couldn't be sustained in the Western Hemisphere. Geography had made the choice for them: the humiliation of strategic retreat. Chinese naval forces began withdrawing from Caribbean waters in small groups, trying to minimize the political impact of what was obviously a complete strategic failure. But there was no disguising the fundamental lesson: China couldn't project sustained military power into America's geographic sphere. The retreat wasn't just military, it was psychological. Chinese diplomats across Latin America were reporting that their local partners were losing confidence in China's ability to protect them from American pressure. If China couldn't defend its own ships in international waters, how could China defend Latin American countries that cooperated with Chinese interests? Xi Jinping's domestic position was reportedly becoming untenable as Chinese military leaders and Communist Party officials demanded explanations for why China had risked nuclear confrontation for a position it couldn't maintain. China had revealed the limits of its global reach to every potential partner and every potential enemy. But the strategic impact went far beyond Latin America. Countries across Asia, Africa, and Europe were recalculating their relationships with China based on Beijing's demonstrated inability to project power beyond its immediate geographic sphere. China's Global Belt and Road Initiative, the cornerstone of its challenge to American dominance, was losing credibility in real time. The Mexican test case. The clearest example of geography's decisive role came in Mexico, the one Latin American country where Chinese economic influence was strongest and American military intervention was most risky. China had invested over $15 billion in Mexican infrastructure, controlled significant mining operations, and developed trade relationships that employed hundreds of thousands of Mexicans. But Mexico shares a 2,000-mile border with the United States. When Trump demanded that Mexico choose between Chinese partnership and American cooperation, geography made the choice obvious. Chinese investment couldn't protect Mexico from American economic pressure. Chinese naval power couldn't defend Mexican territory from American military action. Chinese trade relationships couldn't replace Mexican dependence on American markets. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum's decision to limit Chinese partnerships wasn't based on ideology or preference, it was based on geographic reality. Mexico couldn't survive as America's enemy any more than Venezuela could defend itself against American action. Geography had made Mexico an American strategic asset regardless of Mexican political preferences or Chinese economic investments. This is what geographic determinism looks like in practice: political choices constrained by physical reality. The Asian implications. China's failure to maintain influence in Latin America despite 20 years of successful investment sent shockwaves across Asia that Chinese leaders are still struggling to address. If China couldn't defend its interests in Latin America, could China defend its interests in Asia? Countries across Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and even traditional Chinese allies began recalculating their strategic relationships based on China's demonstrated limitations. Singapore quietly reduced Chinese participation in port operations. Malaysia delayed Chinese infrastructure projects. Even Pakistan, China's closest Asian partner, began exploring alternatives to Chinese investment. The message was clear: alignment with China provided economic benefits but no protection against American pressure. And in a world where America was willing to use military force to protect its interests, protection mattered more than investment. The fundamental laws of geographic power. What the Latin American crisis revealed were truths about global power that political scientists had forgotten but geographers never stopped understanding. Distance degrades power faster than any enemy action. Logistics determine strategy more than ideology or economics. Geographic advantages compound over time while disadvantages become insurmountable. America's position in the Western Hemisphere isn't just advantageous, it's deterministic. No Asian power, regardless of economic strength or military capability, can sustainably challenge American dominance in Latin America because Asia and Latin America exist on opposite sides of a planet. This isn't about American political skill or Chinese strategic failures. This is about physics. The same laws of geography that made British naval dominance inevitable in the 18th century and that made American continental expansion unstoppable in the 19th century now make American hemispheric control unassailable in the 21st century. China learned this lesson the hard way. The new global balance. The Latin American confrontation has created a new understanding of how global power works in an era of renewed superpower competition. The world isn't becoming multipolar, it's becoming geographically determined. America dominates the Western Hemisphere not because Americans are politically superior to Chinese, but because America is located in the Western Hemisphere and China isn't. China can influence Asia, Europe, and Africa because these regions are accessible to Chinese power projection, but China cannot sustainably influence Latin America because geography makes sustained Chinese presence impossible. This creates a new global order based on geographic spheres rather than ideological alliances. America gets Latin America, China gets Asia, Europe becomes a contested space, Africa becomes a secondary competition ground. Not because politicians decided this arrangement, but because geography enforces it. The cliffhanger that deafens everything. As I write this, Chinese leadership is facing the most fundamental strategic choice since the Communist Revolution: accept geographic limitations and focus on Asian dominance, or risk everything in a global confrontation that geography has already decided. Xi Jinping's next decision will determine whether China remains a superpower or becomes a cautionary tale about the limits of political ambition when confronted by geographic reality. But geography has already written the ending to this story. China can choose when and how to acknowledge American dominance in Latin America, but China cannot choose whether to acknowledge it. The laws of distance and logistics are more powerful than the will of 1.4 billion people. What comes next will determine whether Chinese leadership accepts geographic reality and redirects Chinese ambitions toward achievable goals, or continues to waste Chinese resources on impossible dreams of global dominance. Because geography is patient, but geography is also final. America didn't win the contest for Latin America through superior strategy or greater sacrifice. America won because America is located next to Latin America and China isn't. And no amount of Chinese economic growth, military modernization, or diplomatic innovation can change the basic mathematics of planetary geography. Sometimes, distance really is destiny.